Hi, I'm Tom.
And I'm Stuart.
And this is Too Hot for Radio. Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the church. What is going to survive of the church in the UK after the lockdown ends? Just this week we heard the roadmap for how Britain is going to be brought out of its current restrictions. And so it seems that by the 21st of June, which is actually my wedding anniversary, so there you go, it was already going to be a good day, but even more so now, it looks that much of the restrictions will have been eased. I haven't heard anything specifically about church said at that point, but it does seem that a lot of the restrictions will be eased by then. Also, with that in mind, very recently I read this. This is The Spectator magazine and an article that has caused a bit of a stir. It's called Holy Relic: What Will Be Left of the Church of England After the Pandemic? And so this really started a thought process in my mind, talking about what will survive, not just of the Church of England, but also of the UK church in general. So that is our topic, and we're going to bring in a couple of different stories along the way as well. I've prayed, and so we'll jump right in. Stuart, where are you at with this? What do you think is going to survive of the church after the pandemic?
Well, we're recording this on Wednesday, the 24th. Is it 24th? I think it is, the
Yes.
24th of February. And last night, in response to Boris Johnson's roadmap for coming out of lockdown, the Labour leader talked about how many businesses, quote, are throwing in the towel, unquote, now because of the lack of government support. And when I heard that phrase, throwing in the towel, quite frankly, Tom, I think a lot of churches have thrown in the towel. I was reminded, when I was thinking about the podcast for today, I was reminded of a Charlie Brown cartoon, and great theologian, Charlie Brown. And at one point, in one of the episodes, Lucy says to Charlie Brown, she says, "See these fingers? On their own, they don't amount to much. But when I put them together like this, like a fist, they form a formidable weapon, a mighty fighting force." And in response, Charlie Brown looks at his fingers and says, "Why can't you fellas get together like that?" and I think that is a parable of much of the British church. Why can't we get ourselves together? You know, why is it, like, for example, the church in China, in their persecution, you know, we're not being persecuted, but they, and our lockdown and restrictions are nothing to be compared with them. But why is it that the church in China that is underground, that, you know, locked down in a measure that we know nothing of yet, but why is it that they can thrive? And why is it that in the United Kingdom, during what is this, 3 lockdowns now, that we just seem to have thrown in the towel? I want to ask leaders, you know, what are we waiting for? What are we praying for? What are we looking for? I am so dismayed that our government has consistently said of late that churches can open, and yet many churches in England and Wales are choosing to remain closed. I know that they were closed latterly by devolved government decree in Wales, but my understanding is that the Welsh church is able to open now. But certainly the churches in England have, and from what I understand, talking to somebody from Northern Ireland last night, that there's been no restriction on churches meeting in Ulster, but yet many churches are choosing not to open. And I just can't understand it. I want to ask our leaders, what are we waiting for? What are we doing? This is not a case of we must obey God rather than men and be open, because both God and the government are saying you can open. And so I do wonder, for some churches, what are they going to be returning to? And my answer is not much. Some churches, Tom, are not going to open again. And I would have to say, maybe that's not the worst thing in the world for some churches if they didn't open again.
It's interesting that you talk about persecution, because I guess it always seems to me that when we think about Christians being marginalized and ostracized, persecuted, imprisoned, and kind of forced to not meet in other countries, it's so obvious what our response would be, which is they should have the right to be able to meet. They should have the freedom to practice their religion. And so I think every Christian, as far as I can tell in the UK, would be like, it's obvious we're all unified in that is wrong. Persecution is wrong, and there should be freedom. But with this situation, there is such a divide, isn't there? That as far as I can tell, a lot of churches, independent churches, and some in other denominations as well, have been given the freedom. You make the choice. And there are a lot of pastors that are looking at their congregations and saying they are of an older generation, many people who suffer with, maybe long-term ailments, or just are elderly, that we don't want to put them at risk. And I think if you've been part of a church where people have contracted COVID-19 and maybe even died, currently in my church, there's a woman who is on a respirator. Is that the word?
Yeah.
Respirator, and kind of breathing for her. And she's been on it for a number of weeks now. Seemingly it looks very bad. And you could see that in a church that's maybe lost a whole group of people, that it's not as clear cut. Do you understand what I mean? So there's lots of disagreement even within Christians. Some saying, get the churches open, get people in, and others that are saying, we will open, but let's be very cautious, and let's make sure socially distanced and masks, not singing. And then others that say, you know what, let's take the lead in not opening so we protect other people. So there's such a diversity of opinion. I think that's why there's such disagreement and a lack of unity on this issue.
Yes, I disagree with, I think you said it's not as clear cut. I think it is. I think the matter is simple. With the churches that could be open, that are choosing not to, they're taking the choice away from those who can and will. And I have preached in a handful of churches in the last year, just a handful, who have chosen to open. And Tom, most of those churches would be older congregations, and yet they have chosen to come, and some haven't. And I get that. And I'm not making a judgment on people who choose not to come because of their age, their vulnerability, whatever. But what it is doing, it is taking the choice and the opportunity away from others. Last weekend, I heard part of a sermon from Duncan Campbell, who was used of God in the Lewis revival back in 1964. And he was preaching about that and talking about how an awareness of God came upon a whole community. He talked about one instance when there was over 100 young people at a social dance, and the conviction of God came upon these young people, and they left the dance. Some went to the police station because they knew that the police constable was a God-fearing man, but the majority went to the church. If there was an awakening in our nation to God, and what better time, what more right time in terms of an ongoing crisis on many levels for a country to come to an end of itself and turn to God. If there was a great awakening in our nation this evening and over these coming days, the churches would be closed on the main, which makes me ask, what are we waiting for, and what are we praying for in lockdown? This is not a judgment on those who can't come out because of their frailty, but there are a lot of people who would. And there's a lot of people who would maybe try church who ordinarily wouldn't, because they're so desperate, because they're lonely, because they're afraid. And let me say this, Tom, you know, we had this conversation before in the last 10 months, more than once on the podcast here, about the merits or demerits of online church. Let me say this, you cannot gauge anything by churches logging on to your live stream services. You cannot say that your church is growing. You can't, because you don't know how long they're logging on for and all the rest of it. But listen, see that the handful of churches that I have preached in the last year that have remained open, none of them are mega churches. Most of them would be small to average churches. Do you know that every one of them has grown? Numerically now, numbers are not the most important thing. I'm just making the point. They can say, you know, without fear of contradiction, that they have grown because there's more bodies there and there's new bodies there. You know, I spoke to a friend from Ulster last night, and the church that he goes to, they've remained open. And he says the room, it was bunged on Sunday night. Now, it was all socially distanced, but he said, nevertheless, they had to get extra seats out. Do you know that in that church since Christmas, 4 people have been saved? You know, would that have happened online? And I know that churches say, and we talked about one church early on in this pandemic, who were saying that 65 people had been saved through their online services. They can't say that. They might say that 65 people indicated a response, but you cannot nurture and you cannot bring to a point of decision online. You just can't do that. But whereas this church in Northern Ireland, four people saved and begun to be discipled, you know, would that have happened had that church remained closed? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there that I absolutely completely agree with, and we are crying out to God, aren't we, that actually in this time of national difficulty and actual global difficulty, does the church have something to offer? Do we have the answer to people's loneliness, to people's depression, to people's frustration, to the sense of hopelessness and kind of just boredom, really? You know, there seemed to be an almost unsatiable appetite for things like Netflix and Amazon Prime. And it's almost like, you know, back in the day when people wanted to put kids off smoking, some parents would take quite an extreme view and like make them smoke a whole packet of cigarettes in a go to make them feel really sick, and they didn't want to do it. It seems that for some people, we've kind of brought them to a place of fatigue with the amount of, you know what I mean? They've watched everything you can watch. You binge watch as many series as you can. And you're like, what are we going to do? People are bored. People are lonely. People are frustrated. And absolutely, the church has got something to offer. My difficulty with the online church is it fits in with a bit of a Netflix type approach to life, which is you don't have to get there at a certain time. You don't have to, you know, TV in the olden days, man, you had to sit down at 8 o'clock to watch the program that you wanted. You had to sit through the adverts. Whereas now, you know, you watch the program when you want. You can watch 5 of them, or you can watch 10 minutes of one. And that is really a lot of what I think is happening with online church. Is church leaders are so encouraged by the amount of figures, but actually the amount of time that people are watching seems to be very, very short. Often people are watching when they want. Some people are saying, well, now I've got my Sunday, so maybe we'll watch it later in the evening at maybe 8 o'clock, or maybe we'll get up early, we'll watch it at 8 in the morning, and then we've got the rest of the day to do what we want. And it is a church that fits round the rest of your life. I say church in inverted commas. And I do think that it'll be really interesting to see when churches are fully open. There will be those that will be running to the church to be able to gather together. I spoke to someone in my church who said that she will literally dance down the aisle when she's able to to get, but she's not a charismatic person particularly. She's like, I will dance down the aisle of church because she's so excited to see everyone. But it's interesting that I think in the Spectator magazine, it mentioned that the Church of England, at least, are thinking that there will be quite a long time before churches fully come back, because it's been a long time where some people haven't been going to church, at least in a building, for like a year. And that is not something that is just simply rectified one Sunday, that actually the implications could be felt for a long time. The Spectator magazine was interesting, wasn't it? That it basically took a very favourable view of churches being open, and actually was quite scathing in many ways of the Anglican Church, how quickly they rolled over in terms of discussions with the government, and seemingly the problems that have come with that in terms of the tithing that has been lost and the church buildings that are now empty. And it seems, I'm sensing, I've read a couple of things online and a couple of newspaper articles of people kind of suggesting, look, we've got all these old buildings, we need to be using them for something because they're empty. And you do wonder if the turn of the tide maybe in the country is, look, use it for a food bank, use it for a post office, use it for anything that can serve the community, but if it's not being a church. And you just wonder if, that'll play into it, that ultimately what the church is seeing to offer now is a space for other kind of community action stuff, which is amazing and important, but isn't the primary role of the church.
Yes, I mean, and we know, we both in preparation for this, you had me read an article about the empty properties, and when I came back to you on it, I think we both agreed. I said, if only they had put much energy into keeping their churches open as they have into this report about using land and buildings for more affordable housing or whatever. Tom, I have to say, I think the last thing any church needs to do is to embrace further a social agenda. In your comments just a moment ago, you talked about what the church has to offer. And my question is, well, what is the church offering? From the very beginning of this, my conviction has been that this virus is a judgment of God on the nation, on the nations of the world, on a godless society. I still hold to that. But I also believe it's a judgment on the church. And although I'm decrying, and you are, the fact that so many churches are closed, it's maybe not the worst thing in the world that they're not open because of what they're not going to offer. The old adage, about offering soup and soap, as it were. If you stop short of offering them Christ, all that's going to end up is people going to hell with a full stomach and a clean body. And that is my concern. We have got to offer Christ. That is our distinctive. And, I was dismayed by the two archbishops, the two chief archbishops of Canterbury and York, who speak for the Church of England, but who, in terms of the world's perspective, we're kind of lumped in, aren't we, as the church? And quite frankly, I'm embarrassed by these men. I'm embarrassed. I'm dismayed. I don't think that they're leaders. I think they're liabilities. The Archbishop of York is not a Bible-believing leader. He said himself that when it comes to the LGBTQ plus agenda, that we have to put biblical teaching to second place and go primarily with modern thinking. The Archbishop of Canterbury, his background is in business. And I think that's reflected on that report I mentioned about church buildings and all the rest of it. Isn't it interesting that what the early church in the New Testament spoke about less, money, the church of today speaks about most? And not just in the Church of England. To your earlier point, before I get back onto the two archbishops, just while it's on my mind, your earlier point of, people have got out of the way of going to church, perhaps. I would suggest that these persons can't be saved. And it's my burden that there are loads of people, not just talking about the Church of England, but there are loads of people who've been in church way before coronavirus. They've been going to church for months and months, and they've been converted to the church and not been converted to Christ. If you are a Christ one, Tom, you will crave fellowship with other believers, and you will want to be in the house of God. You will not need somebody to prod you and to press you and remind you of what your obligation. We are obligated to come before God together as his people to offer worship to him. That is an obligation before it's anything else. And we're still living in a country where that obligation is not being persecuted yet. But let me give you an example of the lack of leadership from the two archbishops. An open letter on November the 4th last year, okay? So November the 4th, and this is part of it. Even though there is much darkness around us, there are also many points of light in the weeks ahead. For Hindus, Sikhs, and Jains, there's Diwali, the Festival of Light. Sikhs will celebrate the birth of Guru Nanak. The Jewish community will observe Hanukkah. Many Muslim communities have just celebrated Eid, the anniversary of the birth of Muhammad. That was the two archbishops in their letter to the country on behalf of the church. The Bible says that there will come a time when some will abandon the faith and follow spirits and things taught by demons. And then on the 26th of January this year, the two archbishops, as the nation passed, the grim milestone of 100,000 deaths, and the two archbishops wrote another open letter to the nation. And I thought, what a platform these men of God have, don't you agree? But also what an opportunity to a grieving nation, gripped by fear and longing for hope. Yet what did they call the nation to? Here's how I've paraphrased it. Consolation over sickness, not contrition over sin. They've called the country to reflection, that was their word, not repentance. And they have called for social reform, not spiritual reformation. And that means that we've been silent on sin and that we have not served our community well as the Church of God, which is supposed to be salt and light. And I am dismayed. And so maybe it is not the worst thing that if churches are going to be like that, I think the best thing is let them stay closed and let them not open again. You know the parable of the unfruitful tree that Jesus told? And the owner was going to cut it down, but the gardener said, give it one more year and we'll fertilize it and all the rest. I think that time is up, Tom. And I think this is a big day of reckoning for many local churches and even denominations. We've not been missed by the nation. That tells its own story. But we have missed an opportunity to the nation from day one in this lockdown because we've sung a blessing over the nation. We got together on that, and we've talked about that previously. We've sung a blessing over the nation, which is for the people of God, no confrontation of sin. And now, when we are addressing the nation, our leaders on our behalf are just talking about comfort, and they're not proclaiming Christ. Here endeth the sermon and the rant.
Stuart, that's a spicy one. There's so much going through my brain.
I'm sorry, I had to say that but it was in my mind to say it.
That's fair enough. I think we might come to some slightly different conclusions on stuff, but I think your main point of the lack of whether it's preaching to the nation or kind of pointing out the sin of the nation is absolutely true. That's without question. And I don't think that should be at the expense of caring for our communities. You know what I mean? Jesus love the poor. We're commanded in the New Testament to care for the poor and the needy. You know, Jesus says, whatever you've done for one of these, you've done for me. And we should be prioritizing the poor. We should be looking for those who are addicts and who are needy in our communities. But we don't just simply provide them with care that someone who isn't a Christian could also provide. I think, is it George MacDonald? I know he's a friend of, or at least C.S. Lewis's kind of one of his favorite authors. I'm sure he said something like, the only thing that the church can do better than the world is grace. Ultimately, the way you get to grace is you need to preach a gospel of repentance. And actually there is an opportunity then for forgiveness. So although churches are doing wonderful jobs at food banks, there are secular food banks. There, you know, although the church is doing, it's wonderful to open up your church for services to addicts, or even to use it as a post office, like some have been reporting. But all those things can ultimately be done by people who aren't saved. So what are we doing as believers? What are we talking about that shows that, yeah, as you say, you can hold people's hands straight into hell, but not actually confront the heart of the issue? And I've heard very few people talking about this being a judgment of God. I've heard some people say it's just the impact of a fallen world. I've heard some people say this is the devil at work. I've heard some people just say God's sovereign, we don't understand, but very few people saying this is God's kind of wake-up call to the church. And it's interesting, that article in The Spectator, that there was one about, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, that they predicted that by 2067, the UK church, I think it was talking particularly of the Anglican church at that point, it will be finished. It will be completely done with. Except the only way to get to that is if you remove the amount of basically the impacts of church numbers by immigration. That actually, if you would take that number out, then the church is kind of done and dusted in 2067. But we are in a culture where a lot of people come to our country, and a lot of people from different parts of the world who are far more religious, many of them Christians. And one of the stories we wanted to pick up with, and we probably need to finish on this, is this talk about 350 churches in the UK being willing to accept migrants, asylum seekers from Hong Kong. And it's interesting, I sent you an article from Christianity Today about whether we as the UK church learn the lessons of the Windrush generation. Basically, I think, questioning whether we have been a very welcoming church to outsiders. Our church has a number of Iranian people, and it really does make you think about, how is our church open and welcoming to those from a different culture? Even more complicated, how do we engage people who speak a different language primarily? But yeah, it's encouraging that these churches would be open to that. And I wonder if that's where a lot of our church growth is coming. You know, I'm in a church where we think over 40% of the congregation is originally from Nigeria. And so I guess, you know, yeah, what were your thoughts on the story in Christianity Today?
Yeah, I was particularly intrigued by, it was talking about Christ ones from Hong Kong, primarily.
Sorry, yeah.
Isn't that right? But I would say, for our point of view, the sooner the better, because I think that these Christ ones, coming from what they've lived in, have more to give us and teach us than we would have to offer them. I've been involved with some churches personally who, over the last many years now, have a Chinese congregation that would use their premises. And then every so often, you know, the host church who own the building and the Chinese church would come together for worship. And I've heard nothing but positive things from those churches who have opened their premises, you know, for Chinese Christ ones to meet. Not exclusively, excuse me, not exclusively, but because, as you say, there's language barriers and things like that. And so I would say please God, you know, I'm sorry that they're in a situation where they feel that they have to get out, but they could certainly teach us so very much. I know that we're going to wind this up, but there's just a couple more things I would like to throw in very quickly for people to think about and maybe come back on, Tom, if that's all right, just about this whole thing. You know, Jesus said to the church at Laodicea, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." I thought, how ironic that there's a picture of Christ standing out a closed door of his church. I wonder if that says something to us. One of the ways to interpret the 7 letters to the churches in the revelation of Jesus Christ is that they do cover all of church history. And if that be the case, I would contend that we're certainly in the Laodicean age, Laos meaning people, and Dikio meaning justice or rule, the church where the people rule. And then this morning, just before we came to do this, I thought about King Hezekiah in the Old Testament. Do you remember after he'd been given those extra years and the Babylonians came to congratulate him? And the chronicler's account of that is that God left him to test him to know everything that was in his heart. Maybe that's what's happening during lockdown with the church. But here's what Hezekiah said and boasted. He allowed himself to be congratulated from the Babylonians. And he said that he showed them everything in the temple and the palace, everything that their fathers had accumulated over the years. And God said to him through the prophet, and all that's going to be taken from you. And here's the church, the United Kingdom. We've said to our government, yes, yes, we'll close our doors. We'll let you close our doors. Yes, we'll let you stop our singing. Yes, we'll let you limit the duration of our services. Yes, yes, yes. I think that we have in large part sold the family jewels, as it were. And let me say this, and then I will shut up, Tom. From the experts, the experts, you know, the scientists like Whitty and the other guy, can't mind his name, they have said that of the churches which have remained open, there is no evidence because the churches have taken such care. There is no evidence that COVID has been spread through churches meeting for worship because of the care that we've been taking. I know that when we went into this, we wanted to be good citizens and comply, but I don't think if we remain closed, or as we continue to remain closed for the larger part, we're not good citizens, and we're certainly not good citizens of the kingdom because we're not being the beacons for hope and light.
Thanks so much, Stuart. And there is, as always, lots of things going through my brain, but I think we probably need to bring it to a close. And we'd love to hear your thoughts, as usual. Do put comments below this video. And if it's on the podcast, do send us an email to info@gmba.net. You can't agree with everything we said today. We would be fascinated to hear from you. And yeah, we'll obviously pick up on anything that you guys do bring to us. And if you've got a topic that you would like us to cover, also do use that same email address, and we will be back very soon. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you.